There have been many reworks in the past. We've had outdated champions that simply needed a facelift, we've had champions with a really awkward playstyle that sacrificed too much practicality for innovation, we even had cheesy one-note champions who were given more skill expression and carry potential. All of the champions, regardless of how ill-suited for the game they were, had some redeeming factor worth keeping in their repertoire. It just needed to be executed more thoughtfully and carefully. I've done many episodes on the Rework Retrospective series, and though I wasn't too big a fan of the direction they took for some of them, overall the vast majority of VGU targets came out better from it. Thing is, even for some of the more drastic alterations like Aatrox, Nunu, and Urgot, you can clearly tell a lot of effort was put into preserving some semblance of the champion's old identity, out of respect for their history and to keep them at least somewhat recognizable. One exception to this rule is a champion who by all accounts had nothing worth keeping, a champion with such a complete lack of thought put into it that unironically, anything would have been better than their current state. It's been a long time coming, but better late than never. For today's episode, I think it's about time we go over Poppy's Rework, a retrospective, and what a retrospective this is gonna be. Let me get this out of the way first. The reason I call old Poppy the most unredeemable champion to ever exist is not because of her cursed skin, although I'd be remiss to say that isn't a big part of it. As one of the earliest champions to be made, the apple didn't fall that far from the tree in all honesty. Poppy's design was more or less in the same ballpark as every other champion back then, mostly stat checky with the only real difference being one or two small things. She wasn't part of the original 40, but was very close. I think she was like the 42nd champion, so pretty much part of the starting crew. What class you would put her in really came down to personal interpretation. But in general, Poppy was a fighter back then in contrast to her designation as a tank now. You still more or less itemized as tanky bruiser while capitalizing on her natural durability, but you really couldn't call her a tank champion as she was entirely selfish in nature, while doing way more damage than what I would consider fair on a tank. Poppy was also one of the first recorded champions to be recognized as an anti-carry, almost intentionally. While you could argue champions like Shaco or Teemo were anti-carries, it was only by coincidence, whereas for Poppy, it seems as if that's what they were aiming for right from the get-go, as their win condition was to single out a priority target and literally hit them until they die. A further look into her abilities will better illustrate what I mean. Actually, you really only have to look at her passive, Valiant Fighter. Whenever taking non-turret damage that would do more than 10% of her current health and damage, Poppy would have all the excess amount. For example, if you had 1000 health and took 300 damage in one hit, the excess 200 would go down to 100 for a total of 200. Scaling this up higher to 3000 health and taking 900 damage, Poppy would only suffer 600. A very crude one-liner passive, just like most other champs back then, but applicably one of the best passives you could ask for on an anti-carry. Towards the late game, bursting down Poppy in a single combo was just not gonna happen. Not unless you had 2 full items more than she did, and even then you'd be hard-pressed to one-shot her. Devastating Blow was her Q, which at times is seen as a stronger version of Jax's W in power, as it dealt bonus max health damage on top of an AP ratio and of course a normal AD, although unlike Jax, the bonus damage would cap out at a certain point. Every champion was obligated to have at least one conventional damaging ability, and this was hers, nothing too interesting to go over. Now compounding her burst resilience was Paragon of Demacia, passively granting her bonus attack damage and armor every time she dealt or took damage, and when activated, she would gain bonus movement speed for 5 seconds. We're 3 abilities in, and every single one of them has no skill expression whatsoever. It bears repeating that most of the roster was like this in the past though. The only modicum of mechanical execution within Poppy's kit was housed in Heroic Charge, the only ability that stayed the same during her VGU, but that's cause it was the least offensive thing worth keeping. You may have noticed that both her Q and E did magic damage, making Poppy a roughly hybrid damage dealer between physical and magic, as she would usually build AD items like Triforce. It wouldn't really matter all that much though. Finally, we have her old ultimate, Diplomatic Immunity, one of the abilities I covered in my video talking about old abilities not too long ago. But to recap, for 6 to 8 seconds, Poppy would mark a target enemy champion with a point-and-click range of 900 units I might add, and deal increased damage to them for that time. If that wasn't enough, any and all hostile interactions and effects not originating from that target would be completely ignored, as in she would take no damage, no debuffs, no crowd control, absolutely nothing if the source of those things didn't come from whoever she targeted. The idea behind her ultimate was to force a duel scenario, making it the perfect ability for an anti-carry, as well as the source of all of her problems. Poppy's mostly single target damage combined with a point and click lockdown if she collided with the wall, as well as burst resistance, and then a straight up 1v1 type ultimate painted a very clear picture that she would be good against assassins, mages, and marksmen, whose damage would be mitigated by her passive while she could brute force her way through them. At least, that's what Riot was hoping for. What they didn't realize is just how exploitable being completely immune to anything not originating from her target would be. Conceptually, you were meant to use Diplomatic Immunity on whoever you were going to fight so that the enemy team could not interfere, giving you a fair and honest 1v1. What ended up happening most of the time though was that Poppy would ult a completely different target than the one they were actually interested in. Why? Because in doing so, Poppy could beat their ass without them being able to do a single thing about it. Unlike Mordekaiser's Death Realm where you were zapped away into another dimension and could only attack each other, Poppy's ultimate didn't stop her from attacking the rest of her team, it only stopped the rest of the enemy team from attacking her, creating possibly the most unfair scenario ever conceived in League of Legends history. Yes, Poppy was a Demacian who are known for extolling honor and fairness, who basically cheated in fights. Most of the time, she would ult the least threatening enemy champion or someone far away from her target of interest, then make a beeline for the actual target, and they had to, somehow, survive the next 6 to 8 seconds without being able to so much as do anything. It was a combination of Olaf and Kael's ultimate, true to its name, complete immunity. Say she was to use diplomatic immunity the way it was intended to. That wasn't much of a comfort either. Remember, as a squishy carry, you had to contend with a champion with tons of armor, tons of movement speed, burst resistance, and lest we forget the 20 to 40% bonus damage you would take from being her target of interest. Case in point, if there was a Poppy on the enemy team and you were either the mid laner or the AD carry, you basically had a time limit. If the game went on too long and she got items, you were f***ed 6 ways to Sunday. By itself, diplomatic immunity would be grounds for a total overhaul of Poppy's kit. There was so much wrong with this ability that I'm honestly surprised no one saw this coming when they greenlit it. It made fighting Poppy really annoying because there was not a single iota of counterplay for it. But that wasn't the only issue plaguing Poppy. She was far and away one of the least played champions in the entire game, around the same level as Old York. One would think a champion like her would be pretty fun, and for the 5 or 6 people who mained her, I think they could attest to the cheeky satisfaction of running someone down without them having to say anything about it. What I failed to mention though is that she would only be a problem in the late game. Her early and mid game on the other hand were a different story. A significant amount of Poppy's pressure was scaling, that is, it would only be realized once the numbers got high enough. Early on when DPS wasn't very high, Valiant Fighter wouldn't mitigate that much damage, so it was, for all intents and purposes, a dead passive on her. Another thing to make note of was the exorbitantly high mana cost on her Q at 55. For comparison, Jax's W has a mana cost of 30 and a shorter cooldown. Granted, it didn't deal max out damage. Old Poppy's laning phase was notoriously weak, weaker than even the likes of old Kael. She had very high mana costs, allowing 3 or 4 uses of her Q, and occasional W or E before she completely tapped out. She was also entirely single target, having no AoE damage in her kit to speak of, and at that point in time, she was considered an auto-attacker like Tryndamere and old Fiora. Unlike them, however, Poppy had no sustain in her kit, and her dash wasn't free targeted, so she couldn't use it to run away, only to attack. Poppy's neutral game, or lack thereof, coupled with poor lane endurance both in health and mana and the inability to push waves comfortably was a massive turnoff for top laners. It didn't matter how strong she was at 4 to 6 items when she wouldn't last long enough to get there. If memory serves, she had a losing matchup against 90% of top laners, even tanks. Many champions were stat checkers back then, but at least they had built-in safety margins. For example, if you look at all of the old auto attackers, Aatrox, Fiora, Irelia, Jax, Kael, Master Yi, Nocturne, Olaf, Trundle, Tryndamere, Udyr, Warwick, and Xin Zhao, all of them except Jax have sustain. Meanwhile, Jax had a way to completely bypass auto attacks. Poppy's durability came from things that only mitigated damage, not did away with them entirely. She was a stat checker with no sustain and a very poor baseline. So the Balance team was stuck in a catch-22, where they couldn't give her a more forgiving laning phase out of fear for how oppressive her late game was, but in trying to make her late game feel like a challenge to reach, it made her early game virtually unplayable. Poppy was such a terribly designed champion that no matter what state they put her in, she would always be unenjoyable to play and or play against. The combination of abilities and playstyle she had was just too cumbersome and counterproductive, and a lot of that originated from diplomatic immunity being the paragon example of a great idea, just terrible execution. It would have been more fair if it was on a champion with no mobility like Mordekaiser. Not saying Poppy had the gap closing range of Camille, but with Heroic Charge having a range of 525 and the movement speed buff on her W, she didn't struggle too much with getting up close, especially since no one could CC her or slow her down for that matter. I genuinely think diplomatic immunity is an infinitely better version of Undying Rage or Ragnarok. While I did say nothing about old Poppy was redeemable, I understand the idea they had. Poppy was meant to be an anti-carry through and through, someone who specializes in disruption. But it's one thing to make it hard for your opponents to do their job, it's another to prevent them from doing their job at all. That was their philosophy going into her VGU. They wanted to focus on disruption, slowing or temporarily halting enemy momentum instead of nullifying it outright. 3 problems had to be addressed. 1, they had to find ways to make her early game more tolerable without having an obnoxious late game. 2, they had to add meaningful skill expression that allows her to do more than her previous incarnation to ensure a satisfying learning curve. And 3, they had to, get rid of her terrible ultimate. And I speak with utmost confidence when I say they resolved those problems quite nicely. Poppy's early game was improved upon through her new passive and Q. Iron Ambassador provided her with much needed lane endurance in the form of a shield, which may not be as consistent as healing, but it was better than nothing. The shield was usually big enough to block 1 or 2 damaging abilities, and over time that would definitely add up. The fact that it converted her basic attack into a ranged one also gave her a small bit of pressure in neutral, something she desperately needed given the absence of it in her old kit. Hammershock handled the problem of wave clear by giving her an AoE attack that could be used both to poke in lane while pushing waves, and they were nice enough to lower the mana cost to make it more spammable. Losing out on the privilege of auto attack enhancements like Spellblade was a worthwhile trade-off in exchange for AoE percent health damage. Steadfast Presence bears a lot of similarity to Paragon of Demacia, where its passive component makes her more resilient and the active gives her a boost of speed, but rather than giving attack damage, she would now have scaling armor and magic resist that would double if she was at low HP. So in a way, it paid homage to her resistance to burst damage. And for the disruption part, if memory serves, Poppy was the first champion in League to have an anti-dash tool. I can't remember if she got reworked before or after Talia, but Steadfast Presence was the first ability in the game designed specifically to stop dashes, and given that many assassins or hyper carries have dashes, she was an excellent counter against them. Only now she could shut down multiple enemies, not just one. I really like this ability. Her W was integral to converting her from a selfish fighter into a team guarding warden. And after they gave her the grounding effect a few years later, it's become one of the most effective ways at stopping high mobility teams. Heroic Charge has been mostly unchanged outside of it dealing physical damage instead of magic now, preventing Poppy from doing a wonky mixture of hybrid. Now what about her ultimate? Calling it changed would be an understatement. They did away with diplomatic immunity entirely, and good riddance. Instead, they wanted to double down on the Disruption Uno reverse card theme by making it a hammer knockup or knockback depending on how long you charged it for. This allowed Poppy to use it offensively by CC chaining her opponent or defensively as a get off me tool. Either way, it was intended to play into the fantasy of being an anti-carry, just in a more practical and less toxic way. At the start, I feel like not many people were keen on Keeper's Verdict with how extremely situational the whole version was and how weak their press version was. But after a few more quality of life adjustments they gave to it around the same time they made Steadfast Presence better, it's one of the more underrated abilities out there, and can be very devastating in the mid to late game since you can use it for things like securing Baron or Elder Dragon, or even knocking the enemy team away from their tower so you can siege it uncontested. In a way, the spirit of old Poppy is still alive within current Poppy, but it's been completely overhauled to be healthier and more engaging to play and play against, which is the overarching goal of visual gameplay updates. Designing an anti-carry around auto-attacking is a slippery slope, as melee auto-attackers have a penchant for being stat checkers, and stat checker anti-carries are, let's just say, not fun. The one potential downside to Poppy's current version is that half of her kit has a very defensive connotation while the other half of her kit has an offensive connotation. She is acknowledged as a warden, tanks known for specializing in defense rather than offense, and we can clearly see that through Steadfast Presence and Keeper's Verdict. But on the other hand, Poppy enjoys being in the heat of battle through Hammershock and Heroic Charge. Although compared to Grom, whose pressure is defending, Poppy's pressure leans closer to inhibiting. That is, she attacks and while attacking prevents the enemy team from really doing what they want to do. So she's more, I guess, offensive warden in that regard. Ultimately, I like the new direction they took for Poppy. I feel that it's weird to make an anti-carry a warden, but at the same time, like I said in the beginning of the video, anything would have been better than old Poppy. So while it's not perfect, Riot has in fact redeemed the worst champion in League of Legends. Excellent reimagining of a once unforgivable design. Let me know your thoughts on Poppy's rework in the comments down below if you agree or disagree with my stance on it. Aside from that, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. Really appreciate it. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter at Vars, join my Discord server, and check out my other episodes on the Retrospective series if you haven't yet. But that's going to be it for today. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.